I open this public session of the doctoral examination committee of the Faculty of Social Sciences with this votum. Our help is in the name of the Lord who made heaven and earth. Prior to the examination, I invite the candidate to give a brief explanation of the research on which his thesis is based.
Rector, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the defense of my dissertation, which is called Not Another Air Crash Investigation. You might ask, why not? I love those air crash investigation documentaries. The investigators read out the data from the black boxes, piece together the evidence of what happened, which is always a surprise. And in the end, we're assured that flying has just gotten a little bit safer. An example close to home for anyone who lives and works in Amsterdam, like I did at the time of my research, is the 2009 Turkish Airlines crash investigation. The plane crashed just before landing at Amsterdam Schiphol Airport, and the subsequent investigation was conducted by the Dutch Safety Board. Many people survived the crash, but the pilots tragically died and so took with them important details of how they might have lost control over the aircraft. Nevertheless, amongst many other factors, the Dutch Safety Board concluded that if the pilots would have complied with the landing procedure, the crash might not have happened. When you get into an air crash investigation story like this, you are hurled through a roller coaster of interesting plot twists that are entertaining in a macabre sort of way. But it's not mere entertainment. The lessons drawn from accident investigations have helped the aviation industry tremendously to improve safety over the years. For example, the Turkish Airlines crash taught pilots the danger of deviating from the landing procedure and suggests that from now on, they should stick to the procedure. The problem I identify in my dissertation is that this kind of storytelling sometimes makes us gloss over the everyday realities we presume to exist in high-tech, safety-critical workplaces like the airline cockpit. Specifically, the widely held assumption that the more compliant you are with safe standards, the safer you are. In reality, there's a difference between the way procedures are designed and how they are actually used. As my research shows, procedures sometimes contradict each other, and professionals sometimes add steps to deal with shortcomings of the technology or skip steps to work faster. And this does not necessarily make these professionals less safe. On the contrary, my research in the role of deviations from standards focuses on everyday practice rather than incidents and accidents. I carried out interviews with aviation professionals and members of the authorities, and I observed pilots at work in the cockpit and in flight simulators. And I engaged with the mathematical and engineering communities that are responsible for risk modeling. Based on what I observed, I think it is fair to say that just as safety compliance shows how structured and regulated the aviation industry is, deviance shows how methodical and precise they are about implementing these regulations in the real world. Pilots, for example, explained to me how they routinely deviated from certain procedures, but with due consideration of various risks that they encounter. They craft deviations in detail to make them part of their everyday routine, or develop them as part of their growing repertoire of deviations to deal with particular situations. For example, how to deal with a technical failure that takes quite some time to resolve when using the official procedure, when you don't actually have a lot of time because you're busy landing and you don't have that much fuel left in the tanks. Then you might want to deviate. Pilots, in my experience, can talk a lot, including about deviations they encounter. So doing, they seem to share knowledge and experience between each other, perhaps trigger some instructors to refresh knowledge and together reflect on the ways they handle the risks they are faced with. So on the one hand, safety compliance is not a guarantee for safety. On the other hand, certain deviations that keep popping up in safety critical industries around the world may actually contribute to safety. Sometimes this difference between the way procedures are designed and how they are used in practice triggers debate. For example, as you will remember in the case of the Turkish Airlines crash, the Dutch Safety Board concluded that this could have been prevented if the pilots had complied with the landing procedure. On the other hand, the human factors investigation by Sidney Dekker, and thank you, Professor, for joining us today from Australia, concluded that the Turkish pilots were not to blame. He argued that in practice, the landing procedure does not function as a safeguard, but only as one of the many factors that pilots take into consideration as they gradually commit to landing. I can verify this latter point of view from my own observations. In a simulated training session, I observed how a captain made a decision to deviate slightly from the landing procedure. He was congratulated by the instructor who observed him because the instructor recognized a fast decision that made the best of the situation. Afterwards, the instructor did comment that pilots should avoid getting into such a situation, but often there are wider forces at play here. For example, in the aviation industry globally, fuel reserves are trimmed ever more tightly and smartly to keep the costs down. But that also narrows the windows of possibilities in some situations, and as we observed, can apparently become a factor that makes a pilot deviate from the landing procedure. Often, however, such debates only occur behind closed doors. The contrasting conclusions of the Turkish Airlines crash, for example, only came to light last year in the course of a New York Times investigations, which was actually about something else, namely the recent Boeing 737 MAX crashes. Up to then, Decker's report was only shared informally between human factors specialists, and perhaps you could find it in human factors libraries if they weren't aware of the Dutch Safety Board's policy to keep Decker's report a secret. With that tendency to keep the debate from escaping into the public sphere, the dominant perspective remains that procedures should act as a safeguard. Some highly specialized human factors communities take a different view, but they still don't seem to be able to get rid of the scheme that automatically categorizes deviations as errors or as violations of procedures, which is what happens a lot. And when deviations occur structurally, it triggers a suspicion, even with the more progressive safety scholars, that there must be something amiss deeper in the organization. This routine nonconformity is called organizational deviance, which is said to have caused serious aerospace accidents. So when other safety critical sectors like medical care draw lessons from a well-performing sector like aviation, it is not surprising that they then focus on solidifying their own safety standards and safety compliance. But organizations and authorities who focus on safety compliance may be missing out on an important part of the picture, especially routine deviations, which is when it has become routine to skip this step or switch those around, are useful signals of tensions between goals or systems or procedures that are difficult to reconcile. In one of the studies in my dissertation, I collaborate with computer scientists using a sophisticated modeling technique to show how different management offices exercise opposing influences on aircraft maintenance technicians, who also influence each other during their regular working day. Over time, their interactions revealed a complex pattern of commitment to safety emerging amongst these technicians. It is a mathematical way of showing that pushing for more safety compliance does not always mean getting more safety commitment for your personnel, which is what, for example, the Turkish Airlines crash investigation might lead you to believe. Does all of this mean that flying has not become safer after the Dutch Safety Board's emphatic advice to stick to standard operating procedures from now on? Well, not necessarily, but it's perhaps good to know, should you get the chance to book a plane ticket again in the future, that aviation professionals learn a lot more about how to conduct safe operations outside air crash investigations.
Thank you. May I hear from you whether you are prepared to defend your thesis?
Rector, on your authority, and as authorized by the College of Deans, and in accordance with the Doctoral Examination Committee in the Faculty of Social Sciences, I am prepared to defend my thesis entitled "Not Another Air Crash Investigation, Reading the Black Boxes of Aviation Safety Cultures," in order to obtain the degree of doctor.
Then I would like to invite Professor Sidney Dekker to open your position. Professor Dekker is a professor of social science at Griffith University School of Humanities, Languages and Social Science. and also a professor of aviation safety at the Delft University of Technology. Thank you very much for your willingness to serve on this committee, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Kerkhoff. On the authority of the rector, and by virtue of my rights, dear candidate, I of course have a couple of questions. Let's start with one. I'll give you 2 minutes to elaborate on an answer, because there's more that we need to talk about, and that of course our colleagues need to talk with you about. Dear candidate, let me pick up on the last sentence that you expressed in your layperson's introduction, which was very well done. And thank you, by the way, for a lovely document. It's nice to have 14,000 citations of my work, but to actually be the subject, not the object, but the subject of an opening sentence in a thesis, that's a first. So good on you. That was very nice. Now, let me get you to look at page 145, if you have it in front of you. Page 145, you make an assertion that actually deviates significantly, not meant with a pun, significantly from the last sentence of your layperson's introduction, which is pilots learn a lot about how to safely do this, that outside of these accident investigations. You then make the claim on page 145 at the top. As I illustrate here, accident investigations may serve as useful guides for a socio-technical research and development agenda. Dear candidate, when I read that, I went, good Lord, you are being generous, because the only research and development agenda that you have unpacked and developed and unrolled and unfolded throughout this whole thing is about what it doesn't do.
Learned opponent.
That's not a question. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay.
Help me understand how you can still stand for that claim.
Learned opponent. Thank you for your rhetorical question. Well, to my mind, you summarized it exactly right. And this, I feel that the most instructive thing that the Turkish Airlines crash investigation did was show me all the things we don't know yet. And because of that, it is an excellent research guide because it shows us what we don't, since it shows us what we don't know yet. This is
fair. But dear candidate, that still requires the reader to understand that these questions exist outside of that air crash investigation. And you are in a very fortunate position relative to the lay people that you have just addressed, because they would see that as and I use your word, authoritative. So if their purpose is to inform beyond people who are as expert in this as you, how would that then work?
Learned opponent, that is an excellent question. Because, yeah, I agree with you that there is, it would seem contradictory that I first show how the report is an excellent way of crafting an authoritative narrative. I think a lot of people who read this will be impressed, will feel that it is signifies a lot of important knowledge, and it does. But it also it sort of hides the things that we don't know. So you're right that for, let's say, if you didn't spend 8 years investigating this, then it wouldn't be so obvious that it is a research agenda. So,
right.
So what needs to happen? So if I'm right, and maybe a better use for air crash investigations is a research agenda, it means that the narrative needs to be constructed in a different way. It is.
I like this a lot. And so it said, but why would we have these people at all, right? I mean, just make it research to begin with. I'm sure that universities worldwide and the NLR would be delighted at that proposal. We had an air crash. All right, we have a lot of research to do, and we farm out the money to these institutions. I didn't see that in your practical implications. I think it's an excellent idea. I'm being flippant. No, but sorry, you go ahead, dear candidate.
Well, I'm so happy that you're so enthusiastic about my proposals. But
Yeah, or about what's not in it. Yeah.
I'm not sure I'm necessarily saying that the safety board is a useless institution.
I didn't use that word, I hope.
I thought that's what you implied. In any case, I think that the way that I can see that it is. I mean, I'm not in their position. It seems to me like a very, very tough thing to do, to come up with a credible story of what happened based on really fragmentary data, and then have to face all these different very powerful stakeholders such as Boeing, but also others, who have a lot of lawyers behind them, for example. But yeah, just and then keep a straight face and tell the story. Well, I mean, it's quite a responsibility which I don't have, and I mean, unless somebody gives me a job, which is possible, by the way, I'm available. But that between in any case, it would be it would be really it would be really. I understand the difficulty of doing that. And so what I think I want to suggest is that to explore the possibility of creating different kinds of narratives. What happens right now, but that must be very difficult. So on the one hand, so you need to do two things. You would have to understand and really invest more in understanding deviance the way in the line of research that I've done, which is go into practice and understand.
Don't explain it now. Stop talking about that right now, because we'll pick that up in the remaining 3 minutes that we have together. So yeah, and the other thing that we need to do, or that
and the other thing you have to do is the whole narrative needs to be constructed as leading up to questions. It's just a suggestion. It's the only thing I can come up with, and obviously, again, I don't have that responsibility. So I think it must also be a bit of a wild idea, but I think it's worth pursuing to craft investigation narratives to the point that you show that there are different possible trajectories that might have led to this particular crash.
But dear candidate, stop there.
We don't know.
Anybody who understands complexity, I mean, that's trivial, obviously. But it's an interesting one. You know, instead of probable causes, we need to generate interesting research questions as a result of the investigation. I like that. Dear Professor Kerkhoff, do I have 2 more minutes for my second question at this point, or
including the answer? 2 minutes.
Including the answer. There we go. So the question is real quick. Dear candidate, you have milked Robert Merton for all he has been worth. 1949, we say, right? And his idea about innovative deviance actually is not what your show at all. Help me understand this. Why are you still stuck with the word innovation? Because yes, you innovate once perhaps, but then it becomes pedestrian, it becomes normalized, it becomes daily, quotidian. How is that still innovative, right? You explore in complexity, then you exploit. It's sort of exploitative deviance, right? You exploit the opportunity you found, you keep exploiting it. Help me understand why you didn't make that step by saying, okay, Merton, really nice, thank you for setting me on this, but now I'm leaving you behind. Why is he still there at the end?
I think it's a matter of perspective. I mean, I think in this thesis, I'm highlighting the bottom-up perspective, so the point of view of professionals who are going about their everyday work. And yes, the deviations that they craft, as I said in my talk in the beginning, you know, it is ingenious, it is creative, but then they become routine. I guess what I'm focusing on is the fact that that the process of creating it and testing it and talking about it is in a way a process of innovation that occurs from the bottom up. And this process has not really has been not that elaborately been described empirically in, for example, the safety differently literature. So it talks about it, but it doesn't as much empirically show it, or it doesn't model it in the sense that you can also check it and validate it with empirical data like I've done in this thesis. So in that sense, that's why I'm focusing on it.
Touché. Professor Kerkhoff, thank you very much. Dear candidate, thank you very much.
Thank you. The opposition, excuse me. The opposition will be continued by Professor José Kerstholt, Professor of Behavioral Decision Making at Twente University and Senior Researcher at TNO. And I also like to thank you, Professor Kerstholt, for your willingness to be on this committee and be here today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dear candidate, on the authority of the rector and by virtue of my right, I would like to start first with to congratulate you on this thesis. You've addressed a very important topic, and you write about it with so much enthusiasm that I'm sure that it will have a large impact on in improving the safety culture in the organizations. So very well done. My question is about the generalizability of your results across tasks and domains, particularly with regard to the role of intuitions in innovative deviations. Your assumption seems to be that experienced professionals also have good intuitions, but we know from decision-making research that even though people do have a lot of trust in their own intuitive thinking, intuitions are not always that accurate, even for experienced persons considering themselves experts. For accurate intuitions to develop, there are some necessary conditions to be met. First, the availability of valid cues. Predicting shares in the financial domain, for example, is far more difficult than predicting the weather. And second, there should be the possibility for repeated trials and accurate feedback. A monitoring task, for example, easily fits these requirements. Over time, operators will learn patterns related to normal states, and with more experience, they will learn to accurately detect deviations from normality. But with more complex tasks, it will be harder to develop accurate intuitions. And I can imagine that abnormal situations in flying an airplane are quite unique. So the question then is how good intuitions in those circumstances can be. So my question is whether you should make a distinction between tasks and domains for propagating more reliance on professional intuitions.
Learned opponent, thank you very much, first of all, for your praise on my thesis. It's much appreciated. Yeah, you raise a really interesting question that I think could be a guide, should be part of future research. Let me collect my thoughts for a moment. So your question is, should we distinguish intuition? Should we is intuition always? Can we rely on good intuition for such complex tasks? By the way, I missed the first. Your sound broke up a little bit. I missed the first precondition that you mentioned. The second was trials and errors and feedback, and the first was availability of
valid cues. So the
valid cues.
So the environment should be predictable. Like the financial domain is not a very predictable system in itself, right? Whether we know which cues are predictable for for prediction.
Right. I think to my mind, the whole point of what I was trying to write about in chapter 3, especially the chapter about deviance, was that pilots are constantly dealing with these complex situations, and they're quite subtle, I think. But you're right, and it is difficult to say, is their intuition good? So what you read is that they have a really good, that their intuition is good and should be relied upon. But there's, to my mind, that there are two sides of this, and I think one is a little bit under highlighted when you put it like this. One side is, yes, I think that part of it is good because it relies on a lot of experience from previous situations that are somehow comparable. And even if a situation is complex, it is useful to have a repertoire of similar contexts. And often these cannot be captured in procedures, but they can be captured in experience. People just have experience and remember, oh wait, I remember this, and like a red flag comes up, and then it informs the judgment. Is that judgment then perfect? No, I don't think so, and I don't think I claim that. But then something very interesting comes in, and I think this is another where deviations play an interesting role, which is the central focus of my thesis. When such an intuition leads to a deviating course of action, it triggers reflection. And that sounds very, very pleasant and very learned and academic maybe, but in practice, of course, it could be something like a co-pilot saying, "What are you doing?" Or "Captain, I don't understand this." Or it can be it could be a little rougher, but it simply means somebody can be. So I have examples in this chapter 3 of co-pilots questioning the decision that the captain makes. The captain often acts on intuition. And because of this, the way that the aviation industry is organized, with both a lot of standardization, but also an emphasis on speaking up from the and an open culture where we're allowed to discuss. We should inform each other and take each other along in a decision. I think you see that that the intuition also gets tested. So you have to explain it, and then in the course of talking about it, you can come to a realization that, oh, okay, so maybe this isn't a great way of doing it. Or afterwards, you can reevaluate. Okay, well, that may have worked now, but shouldn't like necessarily always work. So it is especially also that second process that I want to emphasize.
Yes, I understand that one. I mean, reflection, obviously, and if it's embedded in the safety culture, I think that's really a good thing. But for example, on the time pressure, you know, if you have to decide in a split second, you don't have this time for reflection. Don't you need then, is that not a situation that you need those procedures and you have to stick to those procedures?
Yes, yes, and actually, so what you're saying is it's not always a good idea to deviate. So I think based on what I present in my thesis, I don't have an adequate answer to that, and I always feel a little bit hesitant about making a very tough, like a very clear distinction between when should we deviate and when should we just follow the procedure. Because who am I to make that determination? And I see research trying to do that, but I feel a bit hesitant about it, and I can't fully understand why. It probably has to do with the fact that if a system is really complex, you don't always know whether you're in in what kind of task environment you're at. So you also have a process of discovery. But what I see in practice, so in training practices, is congruent with what you say, and I see that for example, I was observing flight simulator training, and I could see that a co-pilot, for example, deviated from an emergency procedure, and it was then by the instructor told to enter the checklist and use it as a way to structure the process. I don't think it's a very simple either or, but there's definitely something interesting going on about when is this procedure such a useful a way to pull you through a process, and at which points do you need to reflect and so maybe so this question could perhaps be further investigated in flight simulator settings, for example. Is that any near to an answer of your question?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay.
Then the opposition will be continued by Professor Henk Blom, Professor of Air Traffic Management at the Delft University of Technology. And thank you also for being on this committee.
Thank you, Rector. On the authority of the Rector and by virtue of my rights, I have the privilege to ask you some questions. So dear candidate, first of all, I would compliment you with a very nice PhD thesis. And you really addressed not a trivial area, but a very important area. And you did that with 4 different perspectives. I think that's also very interesting in doing it from different perspectives. And the perspective I would like you to ask some questions about is the perspective where you looked at emerging behavior. That's chapter 5. And also interesting there is that you looked at 3 different methods. That's nicely shown in table 10 on page 127. And what you typically see when people look at different methods, they just aim to compare the methods. And you didn't do that. You try to use them in combination. So you stamp organization ethnography and Asian-based modeling and simulation. And of course, in doing that, it's not so simple because you need people that have background in STEM, people in organization ethnography, that you are yourself, and people in Asian-based modeling and simulation. So I think that is the reason you could do it, because you were lucky to have these 3 backgrounds in your team. And now is the interesting thing that you have 2 cycles. The first cycle, you used STEM, organization ethnography, and Asian-based modeling. And after the first cycle, you came to the conclusion, or your team came to the conclusion, STEM is not able to capture emergent behavior. And if you don't understand that, you cannot start to do countermeasures in improving control, since then you're controlling something you don't understand. So that's surprising that in the second round, you only looked at organization ethnography and Asian-based modeling and simulation, and no longer at STEM. And at the end, you come to the conclusion, a few pages further on, that in the future, you should also take with it on board again STEM. And the STEM should use the things you learn in organizational ethnography and Asian-based modeling and simulation. And here, of course, is the big question. Is that possible? How does it work? So you just say, just do it, but how to do that, that's the big question. And to make the question more precise, I would like to go back in your memory to the first year. In the first year, you had the 3 groups, 1 working on STEM, 1 working on organization ethnography, and the other Asian-based modeling and simulation. And the interesting was that it was not a competition between them, but you try to let them collaborate and exchange findings. And now it's the interesting thing, what I would like to find with you. Can you give an example where in any of the 3 streams, the people themselves identified an emerging behavior that was not known at the start of the project? And that's an interesting question, because what I often see that emerging behavior, I'm accustomed to find it by Asian-based modeling and simulation. And then you can find emerging behavior that was not known before. Once you understand it, you can make an abstract model out of it, something what you use in organization ethnography. And then people understand it, not only the ones that did the simulation, everyone. And from then on, a month later, you see everybody already assumes we knew it forever. That's a remarkable effect of it. Once you understand emergent behavior that's happening, then you find it so logical. And a few months later, you already forgotten that before you didn't know it. And that's the reason I want to ask you this question. Can you give examples, an example for each, where they identified an emerging behavior, and then it was made a common knowledge in the first phase. So both for agent-based model simulation, for organization ethnography, and for STEM.
And the opponent, thank you for your praise of my thesis and for this really sharp question. And I must admit that this is very difficult to answer. Because it means going back into the story, the data. And I think you have a really good point here. Let me collect my thoughts for a moment and see if I can answer this right.
Okay.
Okay, so from the first phase, in the first phase, I don't think we arrived at an understanding that much of emergent behavior, as you point out. So that kind of makes it hard to give examples of them. Clearly, the stamp from the STEM point of view, there wasn't an example. So we did not, from a STEM point of view, find emergent behavior. We just found a lot of deviations because it was coupled to the line-oriented safety audit system. The organizational ethnographer, meanwhile, if I go back to my memories of that, yeah, did find a lot of distrust from the ground service personnel towards management. And I myself experienced it the other way around. I was more talking to managers, and I saw that they also felt that they didn't quite understand why, or they felt like there was a problem that they were stuck in. But the whole problem was that because we took STAMP as the guiding process, or the STPA as the guiding research process, we didn't put it together well. So in hindsight, we already identified some problems there that were aspects of emergent behavior, but we didn't understand that then. One of them is, I think, the tendency of what happens when a top-down, through a top-down method, you pass on new regulations to improve occupational safety that aren't really practicable in reality, in the operational reality of the workforce. What happens next is emergence, in my mind. So, and what we saw was in the first phase already, and that is mostly credited to the ethnography, the ethnographer in the ethnography team, is that ground safety personnel basically didn't believe that management was really interested in safety, and felt that they were arrogant, and so developed their own ways of working and decided what was safe and what wasn't. And if somebody was watching, well, then they might, for example, use the ladder to climb up to the aircraft. But when nobody was watching, they would use the high loader, which is a machine that, in some ways, is in their mind was a safer way to do it. But it was banned because of regulations. So in hindsight, we had those aspects, and I think the agent modeler also was involved in interviews and also found these kinds of aspects. But yeah, we were kind of stuck in the stamp frame, so we couldn't grasp it.
On this point, I cannot believe you. I think the stamp, I think it's normal you don't find the immersive behavior because it has not been made for it. But organization ethnography, I cannot say. The example you mentioned is more kind of example of as your vignettes. And you find something by talking to these people, and then you find this letter that they use, which is more dangerous. But Asian-based modeling and simulation, I for sure know, because I was Rob Haas did his master thesis with me. So I've seen the results, and he's definitely had immersive behavior identified that was not known before. So
yes,
surprising that you apparently forgot. That's
and no, if I may continue,
yeah.
I think the results that you saw, but I could be mistaken. If I remember correctly, the results that you saw that he came up with in the end were in the second year. So in the second year, Rob Haast had another go with a new ethnographer that was Joris Bakker, and who I supervised. And we let go of the STPA program. And as you say, it isn't designed to show emergent behavior, so it may have not been a logical choice to begin with. But in any case, we were now focusing on gathering data and developing a model. And at the end of this year, Hope has created a beautiful model showing how the foreign object damage check, what were factors that influence compliance. So the foreign object damage check is a check that's done before the aircraft arrives on the platform, and needs to be performed in a certain way, and there were apparently deviations from this process, and Rob focused in his thesis on the if I remember right, on the way that for example, what the influence was of management trying to enforce a rule which was relatively small, actually, compared to their own belief or understanding of how the process should work. So this was at the end of the second year.
Okay, so maybe I may be wrong on that, but I just, because you don't refer to his master thesis, I cannot be completely sure on this. But if you then look at the second year, so from the Asia-based...
sorry to interrupt, Professor Blom. I'm afraid we have to leave this at this point, and maybe if you have time for a second round, then we can go into this further. But I would like to continue the opposition, if you're okay with that. Otherwise, we don't have enough time left for the other opposition members.
I understand. Yes.
Is that okay?
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Then I would like to give the floor to Dr. Maria Papanikou, Associate Professor at the Aviation Academy of the Amsterdam University of Applied Sciences. I'm glad to see you back in this virtual room. I saw you disappear for a while, involuntarily, I guess. Thank you for being on this committee, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rector. On the authority of the Rector and by virtue of my right, dear candidates, I would also like to congratulate you for a very tricky and fuzzy topic you've chosen for your PhD dissertation. I was thinking of choosing it some years ago, but it can be so tricky and fuzzy. So you're much more brave than I am. That's number one comment. Second brave point in your thesis is exactly the mix that the previous colleague was discussing about, of these different tools that come from different views, control theory, ethnography, organizations, etc., etc. I was very glad to read this thesis because such approaches are much needed, not only for safety culture, by the way, but in general aviation safety. and human factors. There are some excellent points with regards to standardization, compliance, and the compliance culture there is in the industry at the moment. And I like how you utilize Merton's work on deviance. Although, as the previous opponent said, it would have been great if you moved it further from innovative deviance. I have a couple of questions, but because I'm scared, I won't have time to do both of them. I will do first the one I really want you to discuss and answer with me. So in all this fuzziness of safety culture, we have compliance and regulations, and indeed it's a highly regulated industry, it's highly technical, it's high risk, and so on and so forth. You propose something, and I will again point to chapter 6 with practical implications for now. You begin the chapter where you discuss with the captain, and the captain says that's not standard procedure. Quoting the text, the captain later explains that this is how he has once learned to do it from when he was still a co-pilot. So my question is, within the context of aviation today, and as we are heading with industry 4.0, as we call, smarter industries, what do we have now in aviation? We have highly advanced systems, air traffic management, of course in aircraft since after deregulation, but now it's getting a lot. Predictive maintenance. We have several parts of the sectors within aviation that are undergoing high industrialization. In this context, how can the propositions of your thesis work in practice? And may I give you an example so that you can understand what I'm thinking? Is since that captain quoted in your thesis, this is what I learned when I was a first officer. Well, some of those people are already gone from the industry or will be. And we have new generations that have new ways of thinking, new ways of perceiving, new experience, and therefore new intuition being built, new expertise. I wonder, how do you think this context is fruitful enough, or the people that we have will be able to make that switch? Of course, it's much more difficult, which is going to be my second question if we have time, not general. Now I'm talking about frontline. What kind of experience and expertise are they building so that can have the intuition and the experience to be able to do innovative deviance? Thank you for now.
Okay, learned opponent, thank you very much for your kind words. And yeah, it is pretty fuzzy, and it is, but it is all the more an interesting challenge to try and grasp it and say something that people can also disagree with. Your question, I hope I get it right, but because you referred to this particular example of a pilot with yeah, a lot of experience from the old days, and you're saying, you're right, like well, at some point people from the old days when things were done differently than how they're done now to some extent are going to be, well, no longer in working on the line. I can assure you that this particular pilot is very much present still, by the way.
Sorry, dear candidate, to interrupt, or they are still in the industry. It doesn't mean they're retiring and we're losing their expertise. Maybe it's changing. The skills are changing, right?
Right.
Mentality, this is what I mean. Thanks.
Yeah, a very simple one is like the automation. We're using iPads now. How do we? Yeah. Yeah, I think that in essence I'm describing a process that I don't think it. Yeah, I don't think it is that that dependent on this particular shift that's happening, because it also it refers to because it will also be the case that people who are now entering the industry will be facing particular challenges with, well, more digital technologies than in the past. And they will have ways of solving them, and they will have less to do with I just have a piece of paper here and I write and I just do some calculations by heart and I forget about the system sometimes. And it would be more like more smarter digital techniques. So like I use this system a little bit like that, kind of in a similar way to how Ed Hutchins describes like how a cockpit remembers its speeds. That pretty old paper by now, but I imagine that you can have similar strategies and tactics within digital systems, even though it will be different, but I think the same principle applies, if you like, that there will be contradictions, there will be surprises, there will more things that we don't quite understand, but also ways of trying to grasp it. What is interesting perhaps is what I keep hearing is that in the past pilots, for example, were much more generalists and also were able to understand the technical systems they are operating in detail, and that is going away more and more apparently. That is something that's said that makes sense because the software is getting more and more complex. So it's a challenge of the industry to try and somehow open that up in some way, I think. So to that extent, it would be applicable, but it would mean that the industry has to acknowledge that their software, for example, isn't perfect. And well, we can pretty much see that in the recent Boeing story, of course, but it would probably be the same for all the other manufacturers. And that is a massive challenge. It just means a very difficult, it's not this kind of legal formal way of thinking, well, I've tested this to the extreme and it works, so we don't touch it, just follow this procedure. That is not the way to do it. You have to communicate about what are ways in which this can weirdly interact with that, and then what do you do? And then share these experiences.
Okay. Rector, do I have time for my second question?
I think that given the time that we should move on to the next member of the opposition, if it's okay with you.
Thank you,
Thank you. And then the opposition will be continued by Dr. Kees Boersma, Associate Professor of Organization Science at this university. Floor is yours.
Thank you. By authority of the rector and by virtue of my right, dear candidate, congratulations with a really rich, interesting thesis. My intention was to throw many flowers to you, but because of the time, I will do that later on. I guess I'm also sort of allowed to reflect on your cover, as it is an illustration of your own hand. And I'm happy that you breached your own rule. You indeed did open the black box, and you did not find it empty. The opposite is true. It's rather crowded in there, I should say. When I read through your thesis, there are tons of concepts, theories, theoretical concepts, decision-making, improvisation, workarounds, reliability, and what have you. So it's rich. Sometimes towards the end, I had the feeling, aren't we stuck in the black box a bit too much? So I would like to challenge you to zoom out of the black box again, in particular using the high reliability organizational theory, and see if the recent bunch of literature on high reliable networks can be used by you, or the other way around, how your findings can enrich that literature. Why? Because you're focusing on the cockpit and in the black box, while the aviation sector is actually also constituted of so many interdependent organizations. So how can you imply, or how can you use your findings to enrich our understanding of the interdependency of the many organizations? You mentioned some of them, maintenance, operations, and what have you, but if you zoom out of the cockpit again, out of the black box, what can you say about high reliable organizations, networks in the aviation sector?
Learned opponent, thank you for those words. And it kind of was, I had you in the back of my mind when I was writing that sentence about finding it empty. or referring to that. So I'm happy to see that you're returning to this in your question. Yeah, but the opposite side is, I guess it does get, I do find a lot of stuff to write about. And your question, to zoom out to the networks, so how can this be enriched? I'm not, yeah. The high reliability networks literature, I'm not that aware of exactly what it is what you mean by that. Can you maybe one sentence elaborate on that?
Well, you zoom in the cockpit, and there is, of course, you apply the high reliable organizational literature, but you can also recognize the many organizations that are interdependent on each other in the aviation sector. So can you if you zoom out, what can you say about the safety culture in between all those organizations? So the interdependency of those organizations.
Right, learn to burn. Thanks. I guess one thing that I can say is that they find ways to communicate with each other in ways that are not formal. They are very formalized, standardized organizations generally. So of course there are all kinds of formal ways to exchange knowledge, data, and to ensure compliance, to coordinate, but they're also informal contacts, and I described that in chapter 2 in only 2 vignettes, very short, but just to illustrate that there is frequent contact between the management levels of many of the major companies in the Netherlands, as well as the authorities, and I kind of provocatively call this, so there's innovative deviance in these organizations, and then there are sort of accomplices amongst the authorities. But this is a kind of enrichment to my mind, because it allows them to, negotiate their different interests. So my question revolves around also the notion of committed safety cultures, and when is one committed is of course different from the kind of commitment means different things for different organizations. It means that they prioritize safety in some way, but that just means different things for different organizations. And one way to resolve that conflict is through striking kind of a truce with the procedure. But another way, which is complementary to this, is to keep talking. So I understood that there's just daily contact between the judiciary at the time, I don't know how it is currently, and air traffic control, for example, and other organizations. This is kind of, I think this would be an enrichment to that literature, to understand how that informal process happens in different layers. And you can understand that because it is, because if we take seriously that professionals at the operational sphere, they do a lot of coordinating, but that is kind of captured in that operational process that I described. But then the difficulties that arise cannot all be resolved by them. They need their managers and their sort of higher authorities to also to stick up for them and represent them properly. And I've seen that happen. I've seen them do that to that effect.
Hora est.
And now that my defense has ended, I sincerely thank the opponents for the attention they have devoted to my thesis. I now look forward to the decision of the Doctoral Examination Committee in the Faculty of Social Sciences, which will decide whether the degree of doctor will be granted to me.
I hereby adjourn the public meeting of the Doctoral Examination Committee of the Faculty of Social Sciences for further deliberations. Let me check whether we are all here. Yes, we are complete again. Welcome back. I continue this PhD ceremony. By its duly accorded authority, the Doctoral Examination Committee of the Faculty of Social Sciences grants the degree of doctor to David Falco Passanier. Professor Groenewegen, who is appointed by the College of Deans as the supervisor, will perform the investiture. The certificate will be sent to the candidate later, and it will be signed by the supervisor. And I would now like to ask colleague Groenewegen to resume the ceremony.
By virtue of the authority vested in me by the statute of the Vrije Universiteit and as supervisor appointed thereto by the College of Deans, I hereby confer on David Falco Passanier the degree of doctor, together with all rights, privileges, and responsibilities hereto appertaining. In witness thereof, the seal of the university and signatures of the rector and the supervisor have been affixed to the diploma you're about to receive. It's not going to do it like this because you will receive it when the beadle has received the signature. Should I go on with the laudatio?
Yes, please.
You go way back, David, at the Vrije Universiteit. I have tried to reconstruct history as I did before by looking at emails, at documents, at other things. I looked at your Scholar Google profile. I tried to reconstruct what it was. I found a master thesis in the Research Master that doesn't exist anymore, but has transformed at the VU in 2012. It was supervised, co-supervised by Kees Boersma, so he knows you longer than I do. You popped up on my screen at a certain point when you decided to file a flight plan for a PhD with someone on the safety in the health environment in hospitals. And in the Dutch system, you need a supervisor who is a professor to supervise a PhD trajectory. So I was involved and asked to commit money and my time to you. And it has paid off because you have finished the dissertation. I first want to say something about the early trajectory. You were a very committed PhD in many ways, in many different directions also, because part of the argument to hire you as a PhD was that you were good in teaching. And I remember that you enthusiastically and without filing the plan for teaching with me as the controller, decided to jointly with someone else teach for, I think, 3 years, the first year course Organization Science with Karel Roussi, where you received enthusiastic reviews from the students and from your colleagues, but didn't help very much to start your PhD. I think that it shows loyalty, but you were also critical. You were a very critical member of the graduate school, where you filed blogs that were required for the graduate school. You wrote blogs with small pictures that also adorned your dissertation. And it showed another somewhat more critical attitude to your environment that is also visible in your dissertation. I still to today don't know whether the critical block on supervisor PhD relations holds for me or for others. You were very careful not to point fingers to one person, but to try to sink the ship of supervisors completely, all of them, which is a nice way of being critical, but you were also loyal. I think you were very loyal to the point of overcommitting to certain elements in your environment of the department, as well as colleagues you worked with. That hasn't been not always been very pleasant experience for you. I think you were very independent, and I'll use some of the words of the other two supervisors to sketch a little bit the study you did. Your field work was very much based on personal interest. So after adopting or trying to work out a plan for the healthcare, you showed that you are in the core of your character a pilot. Like I think 2 at least, or perhaps 3 in the committee also are. And I learned some aspects of what pilots are by looking at what you did. You were very easy and easygoing and very happily and jolly in communicating with all kinds of people of the ground crew of KLM, of various aircraft, aerospace airline companies. And you always worked your way in rather easily. I've only witnessed one of your fieldwork things. I must say, I was very illustrative about the peculiarities of the airline industry. I think we tried to get into Schiphol. I don't know whether Schiphol has elections, but Schiphol is a state in itself. And we wanted to get some insight in how they handled errors within the moment a plane arrives. It needs to give authority to the airport, and how errors were handled there. And we were, as you say in Dutch, weggestuurd met een kluitje in het riet. So not all your engagements with fieldwork were very productive because they were as secretive as the KGB. They didn't want anybody to look at what they did. And the kind of anecdotes that we dug up at the airport, but you also told to me, and they also told, I mean, they can fire people with totally different employee relations, apparently, than in the rest of the Netherlands. So it's a state in itself. But you were, with your basic skills, very good in getting everybody to talk at least, not overall everywhere access. I think the flight plan of your dissertation shows something different than the book itself shows. In the book itself, it shows partly that it is a little bit, well, I would say, myself would say a little bit boring, but of course pilots think differently. They fly in a crew. The one thing you did was trying to assemble your crew. You assembled your crew early on, then you changed your crew, you assembled different crews for different studies. You led them without any possibility for flight control to see what they were doing. They started at a point where it was kind of logical that you would move in one direction, but I think you even landed on a different planet. So I would like you to describe this kind of voyage a little bit better in future endeavors in research. And I want to conclude because we need to also move out of the way for the Beetle and others. I mean, the time is limited, even in the virtual room. But I think, I must say, I have been very happy that I adopted a wild flying pilot. He really was very fun to work with. David is a pleasant person to have you in the environment. It might distract a little bit when he is around because he can move in all kinds of different directions. But he is also very focused and intellectually engaging with subjects in a way that sounds a little bit more like old school academics than the modern academic world, where you need to focus and quickly move from airport to airport and probably try to load a few articles on the way from one airport to the other and then bring back a few more to continue your career as an academic. I'm not entirely sure what you're going to do, but as a last point, I want to congratulate your partner, Babette, and your son, Otis, that they will see you less stressed, hopefully, in the coming years. And I hope you'll find a good place to work in the future.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Groenewegen. I would like to add to the congratulations of the supervisor and the supervisory team, the congratulations of the Council of Deans of this university, and not only to you, but also to all your supervisors and your partner, and friends and family. This doctoral examination ceremony is now completed. By pronouncing the doxology, I would like to close this public session of the Doctoral Examination Committee of the Faculty of Social Sciences by stating, "The name of the Lord be praised to all eternity."